All right, so I'd like to introduce our first speaker for the evening. Filomena Trindade is a medical doctor and master of public health. She's a teacher, author, and internationally sought after lecturer in functional medicine. She is on the faculty at the Fellowship Master's Program in Metabolic Medicine at Metabolic Medical Institute. In addition, she is also on the faculty at the Institute of Functional Medicine. After obtaining her BA degree in biology, she went on to finish a master's in public health in the area of environmental health and in epidemiology before starting medical school. She graduated first in her class in family practice from the University of California, Davis School of Medicine, and did her residency and training. Did a residency in family practice at UC San Francisco Santa Rosa program. She has been in clinical practice for over 22 years. Please welcome Filomena Trindade.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's been a few years since I was last here, so it's nice. Thank you. So what about women and cognition? I really wanted to focus on Alzheimer's, but also sort of early Alzheimer's, or what's called subjective cognitive decline, which happens before you can objectively actually see someone declining. In most cases, patients come in already complaining of having some decreases in their cognition, but we're not always necessarily able to objectively identify it. But that's really the best time to start it. And then how is that related to diabetes type 3? How many of you have heard of diabetes type 3? Awesome. So that is really what the insulin piece is all about. And then what about menopause? And I'm focusing on women, not so much to leave out men, but because Alzheimer's is more common in women, and we have sort of more reasons in a way, or more things to fix. We're a little bit more complicated than men in that sense. Now, the one thing I want to mention, I want to start out with, is it's not all about the genetics, right? How many of you know about ApoE4? ApoE4. So it's a genetic predisposition that if you have that, you're more likely to develop Alzheimer's. But we're seeing more and more patients that don't necessarily have ApoE4 that develop Alzheimer's. Conversely, a very good friend of mine, her mom is a double allele ApoE4, so she's very high risk. She's 94, she still drives, and she drives her friends around, and she's sharp as a tack. So it's not just all about your genetics. So what we do to our genetics is sort of about how do we live our lives? What do we bathe our genes in a sense? So I just want to make sure that you understand I'm not really talking about the genetic predisposition with respect to ApoE4. That is a factor. But it has been said that if you have one copy of that allele, so if you got it from one parent, you're 30% more likely to develop Alzheimer's. If you got it from both, this is from Dr. Bredeson's work, you're more likely to, or you have a 50% greater likelihood of developing it. But even then, it's not just about your genes, it's what you do with them. So I'm going to try and just go through a really basic understanding of cognitive decline as it relates to, or is tied with, insulin resistance, prediabetes, diabetes type 3, as well as, particularly in women, as we're going through menopause. And then a little bit in terms of, well, why is diabetes type 3 also called Alzheimer's? And what can you do? Because I have my own approach. There's Dr. Bredeson's approach, which I follow his protocol, but I simplified it a little bit, taking in more of my functional medicine background. So I'll show you what I do. Now, so why am I focusing on women? Well, I'm specifically focusing on women because approximately 2 out of 3 people that are affected by Alzheimer's are women. And the risk particularly increases when we go through menopause. So as someone mentioned, really what you want to do is you want to try and start early, right? You want to get ahead of the game, so to speak. You want to start thinking about it in the perimenopausal period as women's hormones, for example, change. But estrogen is not the only hormone. Like, there's many other hormones, which we'll go through in just a little while. But if you look at the literature, there's a lot of talk about, well, why is there such a discrepancy between men and women? And that's been really reviewed from 2017 until today heavily. So there's lots of literature really looking at this. And what they've actually done is they've looked at PET scans. You heard of what PET scans are? Positive emission tomography. So they're basically looking at, in this case, for example, on your left-hand side, that is the brain of a premenopausal woman. And what you're looking at is how much brain activity there is. On the right, it's a postmenopausal woman. So what do you see? By the way, the brighter colors indicates more activity, and the darker colors less activity. So you start to see that after menopause, there's a big change, right? So we have less brain activity in general. This work was done by Dr. Mosconi, and she's written extensively on this subject. This is another study by her that was looking at memory in women with ovarian decline. And what it showed was that in sort of early midlife, women outperformed men when they were matched for age, sort of across all measures of memory. But the sex differences then changed as women went through menopause. So in other words, as soon as we start to go through menopause, our memories change much quicker, at a much quicker rate than men. And she was tying it up to a decrease in ovarian function. So she was really trying to show that a lot of that is related to ovarian decline, right, or decrease in hormones, predominantly estrogen. Although through, and I was going to say through menopause, but really in the perimenopausal period, all our hormones decline. And I'll go through in just a little while how that happens, because I think we often think about estrogen, right? When you think about menopause, do you think about testosterone in women? Not usually, right? Do you think about progesterone? A little bit, more so. But in some women, we'll lose our testosterone before we lose our progesterone. And we always lose testosterone and progesterone before we lose estrogen. But even then, every woman's different. Some women can be more estrogen dominant, so they can have higher levels of estrogen even after menopause. Some women are progesterone dominant, not as common, but you do find it. And some women are testosterone dominant. So in other words, after menopause, they can maintain higher levels of testosterone. Those women are a little bit more special in a sense because they are at higher risk for cardiovascular disease because they're more likely to be insulin resistant. They're more likely to be pre-diabetic or diabetic because high levels of testosterone in women can lead to insulin resistance, prediabetes, and diabetes. Opposite in men, right? Low levels of testosterone in men can lead to insulin resistance, prediabetes, and diabetes. So Dr. Mosconi has done quite a few studies, but there's other people that have worked on this. This group was also looking at how these two are related, how the onset of menopause in midlife elevates women's vulnerability to Alzheimer's disease, and those women are, or that is really correlated to a depletion in estrogens. But they're also saying, well, menopause is also linked to a variety of different changes, right? We have more inflammation, we have more adiposity. Why do you think that women who are more like a pear in the menopause become more like an apple? Did you know? It's our body's way of trying to make more estrogen to compensate, right? So what do we have more of? More fat, right? Because fat is an endocrine organ. It makes hormones, and it particularly makes certain types of estrogens. Now, this study was particularly important because without ever mentioning functional medicine, or maybe they don't even know what that is, they had somewhat of a functional approach because what they said is, well, Alzheimer's disease is a multifactorial disorder, which indeed it is, although it's not often looked at that way. Traditional medicine looks at it more as genetics, right? But we know that it's not about the genetics, it's what we do with them, it's what we bake those genes in. So this study was talking about how it's really a multifactorial disorder, and there's multiple risk factors, and all those risk factors integrate together, right? There's all these web-like interactions. And they were talking about how, with aging, of course, we have menopause, but we also have an increased inflammation that can lead to adiposity, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes. But I want you to think of this a little bit different than what they are saying. I'm not disagreeing with what they're saying, but I think we focus too much on adiposity leading to insulin resistance. I think it's the opposite. And I know you probably, if you've heard me before, you probably heard me say this. I think that we have a lot more adiposity or a lot more obesity going on, or overweightness, because we have a lot of undiagnosed insulin resistance. So on this graph, I would actually put that arrow both ways. Not just adiposity leading to insulin resistance, but insulin resistance leading to adiposity, which then can lead to inflammation. So that it's sort of a two-way street. So what is diabetes type 3? It's really all about insulin resistance and its effects on the brain. And for a long time, I used to think that, well, it's really about the inflammation in the brain created by insulin resistance. But it can also be due to just higher insulin levels in the brain, because it's inflammatory. So we have to think about that, and now we actually have studies looking at that. But the nice thing about this study is one of the first studies to really say, well, brain insulin resistance is really an early sort of form of Alzheimer's. So why is that important? Can you think of why is it important? Is insulin resistance reversible?
Yes.
Absolutely. Is diabetes type 2 curable?
Yes.
Absolutely. So if we can diagnose the insulin resistance in some patients, we can reverse the Alzheimer's. And I would say that maybe in a lot of patients, insulin resist that have Alzheimer's or cognitive changes that are consistent with Alzheimer's, for example, they may have insulin resistance as a piece. So if you're addressing that part, which is often overlooked, you already have a way to reverse it. And even if you can't completely reverse it, you're making it better, because insulin resistance is a factor that you want to look at. This is another study looking at diabetes type 2 might be a sort of risk factor for mild cognitive decline, which can then progress into Alzheimer's disease. So what they were mostly focusing here is that if you can identify those patients that are more at risk, and they're specifically focusing on diabetes, but I want to focus on the person who's insulin resistant or pre-diabetic, which is the largest segment of the population that's not being addressed. Because if you can catch someone when they're insulin resistant before they progress, whether they're progressing to pre-diabetes or diabetes, the earlier you catch them, the easier it is to reverse, the easier it is to cure. And that is that segment of the population that I don't feel like we're identifying. Nobody's really addressing it. We're waiting. We, traditional medicine, I don't do that, and most of my colleagues don't do that. But in general, I mean, this happened to my best friend, who called me up one day and said she was diagnosed with prediabetes. And I said, oh, what are you doing? Thinking that, of course, that she was told to change her diet and start to exercise, have some kind of relaxation technique, right? She said, nothing. We're waiting to see if it becomes diabetes. That's when I go into convulsions. I'm like, no, I don't want to jump through the phone line. No, this is what you need to do, because this is how we can prevent all the consequences. Because it's not just about you becoming diabetic, but it's about the insulin resistance and the fact that you're more at risk for Alzheimer's disease, more at risk for cardiovascular disease, for early death, for hypertension. Do you know that 50% of the cases of high blood pressure diagnosed in this country are due to undiagnosed insulin resistance? It's about the insulin effects on the kidney. So imagine if we could start looking at that, how many different types of diseases we could reverse just by looking at insulin resistance, or what's going on with insulin. And by the way, I just wanted to mention some of these studies were done all over the world, so that we have some there are American studies, we have European studies, that last one was from China, so that it's being sort of proven around the globe, not just in certain areas of the world. This is a study which I found really exciting, because this was back in the early 2000s. And even then, they already had some literature talking about diabetes type 3 and the fact that it accurately reflects the fact that Alzheimer's disease represents sort of a form of diabetes, or the diabetes effect on the brain, for example. And they were talking about how, we focus a lot on diabetes type 2, but the same thing can also happen with diabetes type 1. But the amazing thing that is, even back in the early 2000s, this was already in the literature, right? It just isn't being applied into clinical practice. Now, do you guys know how long it takes from when a discovery is made in the lab, for example, or a study, when it's actually applied in medicine in general?
20 years. 20 to 10 to 40.
Exactly, yeah, 50 to 25 is the mean average. Exactly. And you know what I often hear when I say, well, I have quite a few studies that show this, so I'm going to apply it to my patient. From my sort of traditional colleagues, do you know what I hear? Too soon. It's too soon. You're going to get sued. I'm like, how could you live with yourselves? Right? I mean, if you know that something's going to help and you don't do it because you're waiting for more and more studies, but if you look at the literature, it always says, oh yeah, we have lots of studies, but we need more and more. We need to look at this area. So why can't we already, if we're not doing any harm, why can't we start to implement what we already know? I mean, isn't that why science is amazing and we're constantly, discovering new things? It's really about implementing it, because if we know it, but we don't do anything about it, what good does it do us? Now, the amazing thing about this study, too, is that it carried a little bit of additional significance in my book, because it was sort of the first study that I came across that's talking about diabetes type 3, and they were talking, or sort of making reference to the fact that, like other pancreatic intestinal peptides, the insulin gene was also known to be expressed in the brain, because up until then, that really wasn't known. So that you can have tissue insulin resistance. So in other words, let's say that you heard my talk and you're starting to notice some cognitive decline, or you have a family member that has cognitive decline, and you go to your doctor and you say, well, Dr. Trindade said that probably this person's insulin resistant, so I'd like you to test him. So let's say that you run even the best test. You do a fasting insulin, or your doctor runs a fasting insulin. And by the way, if you want to do fasting, you want to do postprandial. You want to do it, look at insulin levels after you've eaten something sweet to see what happens with that peak. But let's say that they do the fasting insulin, and it's within reference ranges. I won't necessarily say normal, but it's within reference ranges. Could that person still be insulin resistant in the brain?
Yes.
Absolutely. It can be tissue insulin resistant.
Yes.
We know that from PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, right? Where women can be insulin resistant in the ovary, right, and not be able to get pregnant. But when you test them sort of peripherally in the body, you may not be able to prove it. So there is something called tissue insulin resistance, and we know that that can happen in the brain as well as in other tissues. So this is so even back in early 2000s, we already had the term diabetes type 3. And we even had some references to being linked to Alzheimer's, or it being a form of, or a contribution to, but it just really wasn't being put into clinical practice. Now, this study I just wanted to show you, because whenever I learn something, my next question is, well, how or why? Because if I can understand it, chances are I can usually explain it to my patient in the way that they'll understand and they'll be able to do something about it. So this is by Middle, and what he tried to do is to sort of explain not just that diabetes type 3, it represents sort of a form of progression from diabetes to Alzheimer's dementia, but he was also trying to explain why. And there's different theories, exactly how that happens. But I thought that he did a really good job of trying to explain that it's all about these interactions that depict sort of, with all these different proteins, how insulin resistance might lead to beta amyloid. And that a lot of times it's due to sort of changes in those proteins, or what he calls mutated proteins, that can actually lead to, or sort of the underpinnings, or in other words, the molecular way in which insulin resistance can lead to Alzheimer's. So I thought that was really interesting. And this is still from the same paper, how he was showing that interaction between selected proteins is what's followed diabetes type 3, or in other words, the insulin effects on the brain that can lead to Alzheimer's. So just to summarize, I'm from the Azores Islands, and this is a picture from the island that I'm from. And my island's a little bit unique because it's very sort of high. They're all volcanic islands. There's 9 islands, and divided into 3 groups. The center group has 5 islands, and the other 2 each have 2. I'm in the center group, and the center group has 1 island in the middle. That's my island. And then it has 2 islands on the south side and 2 islands on the north side. My island's called the Dragon because from above it looks like a dragon, but it's the one that's pretty high off the ocean or sea level, I should say. And so when the lava flowed, as it came down, it created these flat parts, which is what you see there on the left. And those are areas where people have their summer homes, or sometimes they live year-round. But it's also great to be able to hike down to some of those places. One of my favorite hiking spots. So let's just summarize what I said. Insulin resistance and diabetes, type 2, and type 1 also, but we see a lot more diabetes type 2, can lead to cognitive decline or to Alzheimer's disease, or diabetes type 3. Now let's shift a little bit and let's look at some of the other hormones. So I've been focusing on insulin, but let's look at sex hormones and how that can lead to dementia in women. We have to be really, really careful how we interpret data. But we also have to be really careful when we read some of these scientific articles, because we want to make sure that the conclusions that they drew is really the conclusions that the paper came to. Because sometimes the conclusions that they make are not very they're not very good at explaining exactly what they found, and sometimes it's not even exactly what they found. So we have to sort of look at things with a fine-tooth comb, so to speak. So what this article was talking about was, and I'm going to quote, existing evidence does not support an association between indices of prolonged exposure to female hormones and lower dementia risk. There are indications, however, for better cognitive performance and delayed cognitive decline, supporting a link between female hormone deficiency and cognitive aging. So up until about 2014, 2015, maybe even early 2016, we had some studies that saying, yes, there is a link, but you have to be really careful because there can be risks associated with estrogen replacement. But, now by the way, this was a meta-analysis. So it was an analysis of many different studies, approximately 20,000 women. And what you have to do, though, when you're looking at studies that are looking at hormones, and particularly hormone replacement in women and risk, there's three things you really want to look at. Number one, you want to look at what type of hormone it was used. And number two, you want to see how was it given. Right? Was it given by mouth or was it transdermal? Right? That's really important. And sort of did that when you were looking at the study, did the women, were they really taking it, and were they taking more than one? Because that's really important in the studies. And in many cases, what they would do, and by the way, that third point too, sometimes there are hormones that are not available in the US. So you have to be careful as to when you're interpreting risk. For example, there's a hormone replacement therapy that's available in Europe. It's called Tibolone. It is a synthetic hormone that has both, actually it has three actions. It has estrogen, progesterone, or progestogenic, I should say, because it's not bioidentical, and it has testosterone action. In many cases, those are grouped together with women who were on hormones transdermally on the skin, which we know are lower risk. So we have to be really careful how we interpret, and did they really study what they said they were studying? This is a particularly interesting one. This is from 2014, and this is the findings from 9 randomized clinical trials of estrogen-containing hormone therapy in Alzheimer's disease. And what their conclusion was that, what they suggested was that hormone therapy did not improve cognitive symptoms in women with Alzheimer's disease. But you just heard me talk about one that actually showed that it did. So why was this one so different? Well, these were 9 trials. So there were 9 different studies that they included. If you go through and you divide them up and you look at those who were on the safest forms of bioidentical hormone replacement, which was 3 of those trials. So they were using the right type of hormone and the right route. So it was a bioidentical hormone, transdermal, and progesterone was bioidentical, which can either be oral or it could be on the skin. When you subdivide and you look at the studies that were where they were using bioidentical hormones, those that showed an improvement in cognition. So you have to be really careful when you're looking at studies. Number one, to see if what they concluded is really what they found. But number two, what type of study was it? Is it a meta-analysis? So were they analyzing a lot of different studies where they put them all together? In this study, for example, 3 were bioidentical. There were some where they were using the oral Tibolone, and there were some where they were using the synthetic. And they were grouping them all together. So it's important that you look at exactly what was happening. And this is exactly what has been shown in the more recent studies. So 2015, 2016, 17, 2018. And so this is what this is saying. For example, recent studies, such as the Wins-Young and the Cronus Early Estrogen Prevention Study, which is basically the question that you asked earlier. So, in other words, early versus late intervention. So starting early in the perimenopause or menopausal process. And when they were doing estradiol that was targeted at younger women, they showed that hormone replacement therapy maybe will give you a positive outcome in terms of cognition, that age group. So in other words, if you're starting it earlier and you're using estradiol, then you are seeing an improvement in cognition.
At what age?
It depends on where you look at, because most studies are looking at between 50 and 59, but we know women that are going into the perimenopause at 40 and 45. So as a couple of studies I'll show in just a little while, you really want to individualize. This is personalized medicine. You have to personalize it for that patient, because for some women, 50 may be too late. Because if they started at 43, 45, by age 50, you already have death of some of the neurons, and it's much easier to catch the neurons before they die than after. You still see an effect, because I've seen it in women much older, but it's much easier the earlier you start. So you have to really personalize it for each patient, even though most studies on 50 to 59, because the average age of menopause in the US is 51. So this is looking at sex hormones, particularly estrogens, as possessing potent antioxidant properties that play an important part in maintaining not just normal reproductive, non-reproductive functions, but they also exert neuroprotective actions. So in other words, they can protect the neurons in our brain. And they are, and you can see that it's lost during surgical or natural menopause, but they're also talking about how that is associated with mitochondrial dysfunction, neuroinflammation, synaptic decline, cognitive impairment. So in other words, estrogens work as antioxidants in many different areas. We're thinking now more in the neurons in the brain, but think it also in terms of the mitochondria and our cells in general. So this is really talking about how the loss of sex hormones has been associated with accelerated aging, and that can lead to then what they're calling your brain hypometabolism, or decreased function in the brain. But if you start your replacement early, you can offset that. This is another study that actually looks at exactly what I mentioned earlier. Why do we have such mixed data? Why do some of the studies show, yes, it helps, and some show it doesn't? It's about the type of hormone, when it was started, and what route was used to give it. So this is talking about, again, looking at the timing of hormone replacement therapy, estrogen versus estrogen and progesterone, so monotherapy versus you're also replacing your progesterone. They haven't so much talked about testosterone yet. Those have been some more of the later studies, particularly from 2017 on. But also talking about how is that being given. Because what is the most common form of estrogen still being used in the United States? Do you guys know? Still Premarin, yeah. Which is what? Pregnant mare's urine. Yeah, exactly. It's mostly estrone, which we make some estrone too, but there's 26 different estrones in pregnant mare's urine that are not the same as what we make. But you guys know something? Do you know that, have you all heard of the WHI study? Women's Health Initiative?
Yes.
So that was a study that was published that showed that Premarin, because that's basically what was being studied, so conjugated equine estrogens, and it was not just Premarin, it was Prim-Pro, it was conjugated equine estrogens with progestin, with a synthetic progesterone. Actually, I can't call it progesterone, it's a synthetic progestin, because progestin is a synthetic form. When you say progesterone, it's more the bioidentical type. So, which is basically what we make. So when that study came out, we were told we have to stop hormone replacement therapy in all women because they're having more strokes, right? More breast cancer, and what else? Heart disease, and unopposed, if there was unopposed uterine cancer too. But even back then, do you know that if you, because there were different groups, if you looked at the group of women who didn't have a uterus, so they received Premarin only, not Progestogen, even though it was the wrong type of estrogen, the wrong route, because it was oral, it was by mouth, right? And you should never take an estrogen by mouth. Do you know that those women did not have higher risk of breast cancer? It was actually lower than the general population. It was about the progestin. I'm not advocating that we use pregnant mare's urine. I don't do it, and I don't believe any estrogen should ever be given orally. Ever. Because we have studies from 80,000 women, and we know that on the skin does not increase your risk of breast cancer, does not increase your risk of a stroke, right, or cholecystitis or deep venous thrombosis. So, but even so, we really need to focus on what are the studies studying, and were they using, on the women that they studied, whether they mix all the groups together. And this is exactly what this is talking about. Another one. This is looking at recent advances in menopause therapy, including transdermal estrogen therapy, have a favorable influence on the balance of benefits and risks. A case can be made for menopause hormone therapy in healthy postmenopausal women for 5 to 10 years, starting during the menopausal transition. So when you're starting to have symptoms, right, but you're not fully through menopause. So what is the definition of menopause in medical terms? You know? For how long? 1 year. Which means that really you need to be addressing it before then, right? Because I just showed you in that earlier picture of the brain that the earlier you start, when women are starting to have changes in the hormone balance, because it's all about hormones being in balance, and we're seeing that earlier and earlier in women. So this is talking about the window of opportunity, so being 5 to 10 years after symptoms, not just necessarily after diagnosis of menopause, but what they're calling the menopausal transition, which is when a woman becomes symptomatic. So, we know about insulin resistance, right? Diabetes type 3 being a form of Alzheimer's. We also know that particularly in women, it's about the form and the type of estrogen and how it's being used. So estrogen should always be transdermal on the skin. And we know that even in women who have a higher chance of developing a blood clot, if you're using it on the skin, it does not increase your risk. Now, what about progesterone? Many of the studies talk about progestogen. The problem is when you hear that term, you don't know if it's synthetic or not. If you hear progesterone, you know that it's identical to what our body makes, or what we call bioidentical. But if it just says progestogen, you don't know if it was synthetic or not. And I'm amazed at how this day and age, I still have women coming to me on synthetic progestogens. Even when we know that those were the ones that were responsible for the increase in cardiovascular disease and stroke, right? Pretty sad, especially when we have other things available. Why is that still happening? Insurance. And what else?
Repeat what I said.
So I said, I heard insurance, standard of care. Where does standard of care come from? Who establishes it?
Big pharma.
Big pharma, thank you. Who said that? Really, because when you look at the European literature, why do European women have a lot lower rates for cancer, for example, than women in the US do? Especially menopausal women. Were they using Premarin? They were not. They were predominantly using estriol, so which is a safer form of estrogen, but I believe that you might need to use a combination because estradiol has a little bit more effects on the brain than estriol does. But the funny thing is, I practice in Portugal too. I have a medical license there. So I can write a prescription for estriol there. It's available at every pharmacy. Do you know that in the United States, I cannot write a prescription for estriol and just have a patient go to any pharmacy? It has to be compounded, so it has to go to a compounding pharmacy. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, really, but the sad part is that for a long time, certain pharmaceutical companies have tried to shut down the compounding pharmacies. Isn't it funny that it's the same company that sells estriol in Europe that has been trying to shut down the compounding pharmacies in the United States that make estriol?
Aren't they trying to shut it down totally, all the bioidentical compounding now?
Yeah, they are, but estriol has been like the biggest beef. That's what they've been focusing on a lot. So how do we take this information? So we know about hormones, a little bit about insulin. How do we put it together? And so how do we put it to help our perimenopausal woman? Well, one, I started out with the studies by Dr. Mosconi. And she published a study in 2017, and she says the optimal window of opportunity for intervention is early in what she calls the endocrine aging process. So it's when women start to become symptomatic. And it's all about bringing back balance, because no two women are the same. Even though we all may make the same hormones, right? Some of us may lose our testosterone first, others may lose our progesterone. You don't necessarily have to be given the same thing, right? It's not the one pill fits all. It's not just a combined conjugated equine estrogen with progesterone, because some women may not need estrogen. They may just need their progesterone increased, or their testosterone increased, or maybe all they need is their insulin decreased, because insulin is an upstream hormone. In other words, insulin has an effect on all these other hormones. So sometimes if you fix the insulin resistance, you may not have a hormone imbalance. And it's all about finding that balance again. Because you have to understand that we have to first know where each person's at, right? We have to draw levels. We have to get a complete history. We have to figure out when did symptoms start. What were some of the symptoms? What are some of the symptoms that they're having? Because all these hormones work together. They're like a web. We always call them the web of interactions. And then we want to make sure that we have studies that are showing us that they've taken all those things together. This was talking about looking at people that are at risk for Alzheimer's disease, and so within a healthy population trying to figure out who are at risk. And they were talking about taking all these different biomarkers and putting them all together. Really having this concerted multifactorial approach where you're not just looking at one pill for everyone. Because to me, balancing a woman's hormones, and I'm picking on women because women are harder. Men have basically one hormone to balance, right? You could argue that their testosterone is related to what's going on with their thyroid and their adrenals, and we have to look at which enzymes are breaking it down and what it's being converted to, but that's the same way in women, right? But we have three. I mean, yeah, men also need estradiol, just in much lower doses. But we're a little more difficult, right? Because women are known for what? Multitasking, more so than men. What do you think that is? It's not just genetic, it's our hormones that allows us to do that, right? So it's important that we look at it like you look at a symphony. So in order for a symphony to play beautiful music, what do you need? You need a good conductor, and you need each instrument fine-tuned, right? And then you need to make sure that they're making beautiful music together, right? So it is with hormones. And that's why I came up with the Saudade Hormonal Symphony. Saudade because it's a Portuguese word that doesn't have a translation. It talks about a longing for better health, or a longing for your optimal health. So I believe that there's an order. And even though I put it in a circle, I believe we should be starting with insulin. And there's all the different hormones are going to have different factors that disrupt them. But it's really all about looking at each one, because the things that disrupt them are repetitive, in a sense. So you want to start with insulin. And I talk about the disruptors of hormonal function with respect to insulin, but really about all different hormones. So there are things like toxins, or history of traumatic events, or food sensitivities, or food allergies. But it can also be partly your genetics, or the interaction with your genes and your environment. Aging in general, because with aging, most hormones decrease, right? Except for cortisol and insulin, thank you, which both tend to increase. But also, sometimes the hormone imbalance came about from a pharmaceutical drug that they were on before. So that's important to know that. So it's like you have to take a history, not just of what's going on now, but what has happened to that patient up until now. So you have to look at things in the past But we also really want to look at what's going on with the gut microbiota. Because we know about the gut microbiota being responsible for our immune system, right? And keeping it in check. But do you know that the gut microbiota also makes hormones? It also metabolizes hormones, right? It helps us make some of our vitamins, particularly our B vitamins, and it helps recycle them. So that's an area that can also cause hormonal disarray or hormonal imbalance that I feel it's often forgotten. So you can take my list and you can use it for any hormonal dysfunction, almost any disease or dysfunction in general. But I believe we really have to start with a patient and their history, because everybody's different, and figure out what has happened to them thus far, right, that has brought about the imbalances that you see. And in menopausal women, we know that some of it is aging, but really it has a lot to do with what type of life they have led and everything else that has happened up to them up until now. And I put the slide in here because it's not that I forget everything I learned in medical school. We use it, but I use it in a slightly different approach. So I pay a lot more attention to their history and what has happened in terms of their hobbies and how much stress have they had in their life, right? And I really focus on doing a thorough physical exam, something I didn't learn very well in medical school and sort of had to learn on my own.
What's the purple circle?
The purple circle is thyroid. So, I'm sorry, I should have gone over that. So I'm sorry, it's insulin, adrenal, thyroid, sex hormones, estrogen metabolism. The colors came off a little different on my PowerPoint. So you want to start with insulin, then look at adrenals, then thyroid, then sex hormones. And why do you think I put estrogen metabolism up there? What is estrogen metabolism? Does anybody know?
What's the one in the purple?
Adrenal. Adrenal. So, yeah, it's also inflammatory, but it's also giving us a way or a sort of road to look at metabolism. And metabolism is what, with respect to estrogen? It's detoxification. So you're looking at how someone detoxifies. But to me, estrogen metabolism is what's really important in assessing risk for cancer, whether it's a man or a woman, and we have studies to prove it. So in other words, it's not about the estrogen per se that can cause breast cancer risk or any hormone-related cancer. It is if you're using the wrong type and the wrong route, right? But it's about how that woman metabolizes it. And there's 3 different pathways that they can use. And the reason why that's so important is because although that's partially genetically determined, do you know that our exposures can change that? So if you have exposures to a lot of toxins, particularly endocrine disruptors, or like your bisphenols, your phthalates, or dioxins, for example, it can make you detoxify your estrogen through the wrong pathway and increase your risk for cancer. Prostate cancer in men, any hormone-related cancer in women. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So to me, it's important to start with insulin. Now sometimes I may be doing insulin, adrenal, and thyroid at the same time, or I may be even looking at sex hormones, but it's about the order in which you address them, because insulin has a lot of downstream hormones. So if you look at at insulin first and you balance it many times, you've balanced your estrogen, your progesterone, your testosterone. It's important that we look at that, but that we also look at the effects that insulin can have downstream, and especially in women. Because insulin can also affect your thyroid, it can affect your adrenals. Now, for a long time, we knew that women who have more vasomotor symptoms, so more hot flashes, sort of a worse menopause, right? That they had more heart disease. We knew that. We've known that for a long time. By the way, what do you think happens to women's rate of heart disease compared to men when we go through menopause? Is it the same? Is it less? Is it more?
It's gonna be the same.
More. Much higher. Yet most of the studies are done on men, right? But our rates actually go way up. And we knew that women who had more symptoms, so they were more symptomatic. They had more hot flashes, more night sweats, especially those that were prolonged, that they had more heart disease. But they didn't know why. And initially I thought it was because you have to look at all the different hormones and balance each hormones. Well, it's actually because those women are more insulin resistant. And in many cases, they're not pre-diabetic and they're not diabetic, but they are insulin resistant. So they have higher amounts of insulin. And they may stay as insulin resistant, but never actually develop full-blown diabetes. That's extremely important. This is looking at the HOMA index. So the HOMA index is more of a research tool, but it only looks at fasting insulin and fasting glucose. So it's good, but many times you can have a normal fasting insulin, but the moment you eat something really sweet, your postprandial, so your insulin after you eat, shoots up much more. So it's important that we look at postprandial too, although I still have to convince a lot of doctors about that. But it is important. This is another study looking at women with vasomotor symptoms, which are associated with insulin resistance, had a lot more symptoms, so they had a lot more hot flashes, which translated into higher risk of heart disease.
Could you explain vasomotor?
Oh, vasomotor symptoms are your symptoms of menopause. So it's hot flashes, night sweats, predominantly those two, but it can be headaches, it can be mood changes, right? But that's what they mean when they say vasomotor symptoms. This is just another study to show you that it's not just one or two, there's actually many. Looking at women with more hot flashes, more night sweats, being more associated with insulin resistance, which translates into more heart disease. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go into detail on treatment on everything, so I just included one slide. I like rules of three, because usually 3 things I can remember, and if I can remember, chances are my patients can remember. So my rules of 3 for dealing with insulin resistance is number 1, decreasing your insulin stimulation. So working on your diet. Not just removing sugar, but removing anything that your body can see as sugar, or anything that can make you more inflammatory. Right? Like removing gluten or dairy or corn, whatever your body is reacting to. Number 2 is addressing and modifying the gut microbiota. Because we know that just changes in the gut microbiota, so the good protective bacteria in your gut, makes you more likely to develop insulin resistance. And sometimes that could be the only thing. And it does it by a couple different mechanisms. Number 1 is by just changes in the gut itself, you can increase inflammation. But also changes in the gut microbiota can lead to toxins being translated from the gut into the pancreatic beta cell, to the pancreas, and causing damage. And that in itself leads to insulin resistance. The number 1 thing right now in terms of causes of insulin resistance is damage to the cells of the pancreas that make insulin. And this is not just toxins that you would think of, like your heavy metals or your pesticides, but it's food additives that we haven't thought of as toxins that are toxins or toxic to the pancreatic beta cell. Now, if you guys know how carrageenan got taken off the market now, most things it was used as a thickener in many of the non-dairy milks. Well, carrageenan, right, was found by Dr. Barbara Corky to be damaging to the pancreatic beta cell, and that can lead to insulin resistance. And then my 3rd thing is increasing your cellular responsiveness to insulin. So giving the body those things that are going to increase insulin sensitivity. They're going to help insulin get inside the cell. And these are things like herbs and spices, but they can also be your nutraceuticals like magnesium and chromium and CoQ10. Right? All things are important. Now this is just one more study before I move on to adrenals that talks about Alzheimer's. Remember how I talked about Alzheimer's as diabetes type 3? And it was talking about that not only can you sort of reverse it, even though they were talking about using intranasal insulin, they were also talking about ketogenic diet. So I put this in here. I'm not advocating that everyone should be on a ketogenic type diet because I think you need to be prepared for that. But I glean from the literature any study that I can find that talks about lifestyle modification and diet. Because we know that, for example, what is the best diet for someone who's insulin resistant? Low carb. Could be ketogenic, but you have to prepare the patient because not everyone can do the ketogenic diet without being really looked at and making sure that they're not too toxic. But also it's a Mediterranean type of diet. Not the Mediterranean that eats lots of pasta, right? But the Mediterranean that eats like the rainbow and has a lot of green leafy vegetables and eats olives and avocados, right, and fish. Key. So let's move on to adrenals. And we know that the adrenals can make all of the steroid hormones, right? So I look at the adrenals as like the backup system. So I often think about my grandmother, who, when I used to ask her about menopause, she would tell me, I go, Grandma, how'd you know when you were going through menopause? And she said, well, one day my period stopped coming. And I was like, really? So no hot flashes, no night sweats, no mood changes? She was like, no. So I don't have any patients that comes to me with that type of menopause today. Well, awesome, but that's because you're so low key and cool. So why do you think that is? And why? Because I'm seeing the opposite. I'm seeing more and more women going through menopause at earlier ages. Diet and what else? Toxins, stress. I mean, were we made to multitask? Yes, we had it. Our brain doesn't like multitasking. You know, I used to love to multitask. I thought it was like luminosity, right? It was a good way to get more neurons made. And now I know, no, it's not. It actually kills neurons. Right? So I just think that the adrenals are like sort of your backup system when you're going through menopause. So if you have good adrenal reserve, right? It's like if you think of it as your adrenal bank account, so to speak. If it's robust, then when you start to go through menopause, it can come in and sort of make do, because it can make all the hormones. It'll make them at a little bit lower levels, right? But I always say the average adrenal is smarter than the smartest doctor. It can come in and make the difference so that you have an easier transition, so that you don't go from, you know, having high levels to nothing, right? It kind of buffers you in. But if you have no adrenal reserve because you've been multitasking, you know, you're working, taking care of the kids and the grandparents, and you know, and you're driving in today's society, right? And eating bad food, your adrenals are, you're not going to have a lot of adrenal reserve. And I think this is why we're seeing more and more women with PMS, for example, which is when we're stressed, we're going to make more of the stress hormones, right? So we're going to divert our precursors down into the glucocorticoid pathway, into cortisol. Normally, that should be going down to making some of your sex hormones. That's what's been called the cortisol steal or the pregnenolone steal. It's really not a steal per se, it's a diversion. But we're seeing a lot more of that because we live in such a sympathetic dominant state. What do I mean? I mean, we're all on adrenaline overdrive, right? And so that is going to put us more at risk for insulin resistance, right? For adrenal dysfunction, for not having a good adrenal reserve, and for going through menopause at an earlier state. And not having sort of really all the precursors that you need also for your brain. We've been talking a lot about the adrenals, but also about the brain. Now, when it comes to treatment, I like using Hans Selye's research and his theories, as well as his stages. He says there's 3 stages of adrenal dysfunction: stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. Stage 1 is sort of when you're initially stressed, so your cortisol and your DHEA, which DHEA is sort of like the adrenal reserve in a way. It gives you a way to have a look at what's the catabolism and anabolism that someone's in, because we all should be in balance, right? We should be breaking down the body just as well as we're rebuilding. But when you're in the perimenopause, you're not. You're more catabolic. And then stage 2 is when, or what he calls adaptation, is when you have a prolonged stressor, but you sort of can no longer keep up, so your DHA starts to decrease. And then stage 3 is when you're exhausted, so both cortisol and DHA are low. But it's the high amount of time that we spent in stage 1 where our cortisol is high that I think is leading to a lot of the hormonal problems that we see, or the hormonal imbalances. And when it comes to adrenal, diet is key, really having a foundation, but even more important is changing your lifestyle, is learning what does your body need to relax and to get out of that sort of sympathetic dominant state. So we have adaptogens, we have a diet and lifestyle, but also sometimes you need some nutraceuticals to really help with that, and in some cases you need actual hormone replacement. So stage 3, or sort of my third circle, is thyroid. Now, thyroid, we often think about being sort of the maker of thyroid hormone. But it's not exactly true, because it's all about what's going on with the hypothalamus to the pituitary, then communicating to the thyroid. Because the active thyroid hormone is T3. The thyroid only makes 5% of T3. The other 95% of what it makes is T4. Think of it as the body always makes sort of the stored hormone, and then it has to activate it as it needs it. right? So the thyroid makes predominantly T4. T4 has to be converted to T3 because only T3 can get inside the cell and do work, but that conversion happens in the kidneys and the liver. But when you go to most doctors, and they're looking at thyroid function, what do they check? TSH. What does TSH tell you? Communication from the pituitary to the thyroid, but it doesn't tell you about the conversion, right? Because the conversion doesn't happen in the thyroid. And the thing is that both T3 and T4 feed back. So you really need to look at a whole thyroid panel when you're looking at free T3, free T4, TSH, and you need to look at antibodies to the thyroid because sometimes the function can look normal, but someone can have symptoms of being low thyroid. That can happen for a few different reasons, but one is autoimmune thyroiditis, is when your body has developed antibodies to the thyroid, and there's two types and you need to check two, anti-peroxidase and anti-thyroglobulin. So to me, only after you have really normalized or sort of re-equilibrated, if you will, your insulin, your adrenals, and your thyroid, then look at your sex hormones, because in many cases, the imbalances in the sex hormones, so your estrogen, your progesterone, your testosterone, were due to changes in these other areas. So by the time you look at the sex hormones, it may be normal. I've been talking about women, but I see this a lot in men. You know, many men come to me with low testosterone. But then the answer is not to give them testosterone, it's to find out why. Because if someone is hypothyroid, even if it's just subclinical hypothyroidism, that's going to affect their ability to produce testosterone. So in many cases, or they're insulin resistant. In many cases, it's due to insulin resistance. Adrenal dysfunction can happen in men, but men seem to be a little more immune to it than women are, but definitely thyroid function. So you really need to look at everything, all the different hormones. Now when it comes to sex hormones, I already talked quite a bit about estrogen and progesterone, but I think it's important that we look at what happens as women go through menopause. Because we often think that estrogen decreases, right? No. You see what's flatline? Progesterone. And in the perimenopause, many women actually become what's called estrogen dominant. That means that there should be a ratio between estrogen and progesterone, and we lose our progesterone first. So we're usually estrogen dominant in the perimenopause. And being estrogen dominant is not good because it puts us more at risk for some of those hormone-related cancers, especially if we're not metabolizing the estrogen in the best pathway. So this is the French study. So the French study was a study that looked at, the initial study was 50,000 women, the follow-up study was 80,000 women, 80,377. And what they were looking at is sort of, does estrogen replacement, does hormone replacement really increase risk with respect to breast cancer? And what they found was no, it does not if you're using it on the skin, so transdermal, and you're using bioidentical, and with progesterone, it can be oral, or it could be on the skin. It could be transdermal, it could be transvaginal actually, but it needs to be the bioidentical. This is a study looking at conjugated equine estrogens, which is Curable, right? And methoxyprogesterone acetate, so synthetic progesterone, versus a natural progesterone and its effects on memory. Who do you think did better? Natural. The natural progesterone, even though they were using the wrong estrogen. Exactly, which goes to prove that a lot of it is really about the progestin. Now, this is a really interesting study because what do we worry the most about when, let's say that we've fixed in someone's insulin, it's a woman, and thyroid and adrenal, so insulin, adrenals, thyroid, but they're still low on, say, on their estrogen or progesterone, for example. And they also have high blood pressure, and high cholesterol, let's say, which wouldn't happen so much with the patients I see, because by the time you fix insulin, everything else is pretty much fixed, especially their cholesterol panels. I'm not talking about their expanded cholesterol panels. But what they were talking about here was, if you're just in a traditional practice and someone comes to you and it's what they're calling a poor metabolic phenotype. So it's a woman that has high cholesterol, she's overweight, and she has high blood pressure. Is it safe to put that person on hormones? What do you think?
No.
Yes.
It is, actually. And they weren't even looking at insulin. See, I always thought, no, it's not. But by the time you address insulin and you address the adrenals and thyroid, it is, because you fix their main problem. But in this study, and there's other studies like this, it's just an example.
But they do compare it with like changes in lifestyle and nutrition. Because
They
that may be giving the explanation.
Exactly. So the question is, well, they weren't really looking at lifestyle. You're right. They grouped them according to, they tried to take as much into account with that, and I agree with you. But the nice thing about the study is that it's showing that those changes that women have that we so much worry about, it's really about using synthetic estrogens, right, or synthetic progestogens, right? Because what they were doing is, even in those women that we would be most afraid to start something on without doing diet and everything else, which they didn't do, right? All they were doing was starting them. These were women with cognitive decline. They were only starting them on estrogen, right? Hormone replacement, estrogen, progesterone. So, and they were not looking at diet, lifestyle, none of that. They weren't looking at, are they insulin resistant? Did we fix it? Did we address the adrenals or thyroid? They were just saying, if they're poor metabolic phenotypes, can we put them on the right type of estrogen, and are we increasing the risk? And the answer was no. They're not increasing the risk.
How did they measure this?
Well, they were looking at long term, because this was a long study. In other words, so they were looking at what they had, high blood pressure, hypertension, and if they started them on, I think it was a 5-year follow-up actually, did they then develop changes, like increase in blood pressure, increase in cholesterol, did they gain more weight? Those were the parameters that they were measuring. I'm not sure if they measured death, but yeah. But it's nice to see, because what that shows is that it's about the type of estrogen. It's just another way to prove. This is by a different author, again looking at the timing of hormone replacement therapy in terms of memory and processing. Because we've looked at breast cancer risk, right? Different types of risk. Now we're looking at what is going on in terms of memory, and we know that if you're using synthetics, it does not improve memory. This is a study that was looking at using 17-beta estradiol. So it's basically ethanol estradiol. It's what we have that's closest to what our body makes. And looking at neuronal stress, because estrogen or estradiol to the brain is an antioxidant. So, winding down, let's look at estrogen metabolism. So what do I mean when I talk about estrogen metabolism? Well, it's about those 3 pathways that we break, the way we break down our estrogen. And I can't talk about this enough, because I feel like this is a forgotten field in medicine. The literature is there, it's been there for years, but it's not being applied. Because what every woman should be having done onto her, and not just in the menopause, but in the perimenopause period, and the sooner that you can, is to figuring out how are they metabolizing your estrogens. Because that's our risk, and there's so much we can do to change it. We have studies showing that even if you increase someone's risk, not with let's say with respect to cancer, because of the way they metabolize their estrogens. And by the way, I'm convinced that this is how estrogen increases someone's risk. It's not whether it's transdermal, just whether it's transdermal or oral. That, yes, that does increase your risk. But aside from that, even if we're doing transdermals, we need to be looking at how women are breaking that down. And we need to look at it and follow it and make sure that we're optimizing, because that is totally changeable. It's like you can change someone's risk by changing how they metabolize their estrogen. The tests are available, they've been available for many years, but they're just not being put into clinical practice, which is really sad. So there's 3 main ways that we can break down our estrogen, both men and women. It's called the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the 2 pathway is the safest, the 16 is not so safe, and the 4 is the ugly. So it's the worst pathway. Now, the thing is that there's been so much focus on the 2 being safe. Well, there's 2 phases of metabolism or detoxification in the liver, right, and in tissues. There's phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 makes a toxin more water soluble, because most toxins are not water soluble. Phase 2 is like a assembly line of what do you need to get eliminated. Do you need a sulfate group, right? Do you need a methyl group? Do you need glutathione? Or do you need a glucuronidation? Or do you need a glucuronide group to then be eliminated, right? The 2 is only protective if it's methylated. So even if you're using the 2, you still have to make sure that you're processing it in phase 2. And actually 2-methoxy estrogen is being studied as a way to prevent heart disease in women because it is sort of protective, cardioprotective. So it's really all about which way are you metabolizing it, but that's not just genetics. Because there's actually 2 studies that I included in the slide. This shows that envirochemicals like PCBs, bisphenol A's, polybrominated phenyl ethers, your phthalates, or your perfumes, for example, if a perfume says carpet, that is a phthalate. Those can actually change it so that you are utilizing that worst pathway, the ugly. I said the good, the bad, the ugly. So it's not just about your genes. Because even if genetically you're not predetermined to use that worst pathway, if you have a lot of exposures, and who among us don't? I mean, we live in a toxic world, right? So it's really about looking at the exposures that you've had and trying to offset them. And the amazing thing is that we have studies showing that even if you have those exposures, if you work on glutathione conjugation, you're increasing your antioxidants, putting on your methyl groups, right? So eating lots of green leafy vegetables, or taking your methyl B12, methylfolate, whichever you need, that can change your risk. To me, that's powerful. This is how you assess and how you reverse someone's risk. And I'm particularly talking about risk for women with breast cancer, uterine cancer, any hormone-related cancer. In men, it's been shown with prostate cancer, but also with their risk of lymphoma, is associated with how they metabolize their estrogens. So to me, it's really only with putting all this together and looking at insulin, looking at the adrenals, thyroid, your sex hormones, but also how are they being metabolized? What are we doing to detoxify? That we can make that beautiful music that we can all dance together. And believe me, I love dancing, and I love dancing to good music. So I hope this has been useful to you, and we're taking questions now or later?
Next.
After.
Okay, I wanted to ask just briefly about IUDs, because I know it's popular to use the IUD with the Marina, and I often recommend the copper or something other than a synthetic progestin. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I have a real issue with that. So the question was, well, you guys all heard it, right? About Marina versus a regular IUD. Am I correct? So Marina, it's an IUD that also has progestogen. It's a synthetic progestin. It's not progesterone. And it's only available, you only put it in for 3 years, 3 to 4 years. So I see a lot of my colleagues using it more than the copper IUD, which doesn't have any hormone, does have copper, but it doesn't have any hormone associated with it, and that lasts up to 12 years. My background's in nonprofits, and until I started doing them in my clinic, we were sending them out. And so a lot of the GYNs were putting in the Marina because they get more money, right? Every 3 years they have to come in and they get more for it. I used to be really against the IUD. Before I was really in health, like when I was in public health, I thought it was kind of barbaric and I didn't like it. I thought we could find a better method. Now, after really looking at all the side effects of the Marina and the fact that it causes a lot of hormone imbalance. Yeah, it's local, right? It's only supposed to have a local effect. It has systemic effects. So any woman who's been on Marina is going to have low progesterone and they're going to have low B vitamins. So I don't like it. But I have a lot of women that come to me on it. And so what I'll do is I'll try to bring them back into balance. I much prefer the copper IUD versus the Marina.
Okay, I've got a lot of hands, so I'm going to work my way across, all right? So I'm going to go here next.
Did I see on your slide that changes in the P450 enzyme system, such as caused by statin drugs, may increase breast cancer risk?
Changes in the P450 can make, yes, in a direct way. So changes in the P450 is really, that's your phase 1, right? So that can force you to metabolize or detoxify things more in one direction. If we're talking about estrogen, it can force you to use more of the unhealthy pathway, the 4. It's amazing how many downstream effects and different ways many drugs and toxins in general also have.
Okay,
What do you think of metformin for lowering insulin resistance?
Metformin has really good studies. We actually think that the way metformin works now is by affecting the gut microbiota. It increases Akkermansia muciniphila, which is an anti-inflammatory. So I think metformin is actually probably one of the safest drugs. However, it does have some side effects, and it can cause acidosis. And if you're using it at higher doses and you're not checking, that could be a problem, because I've actually caught a few patients that have come to me on it. I don't put that many people on metformin because I find that with food and herbs and spices and things like zinc and chromium, right, and all the things that help insulin resistance, I don't need to. But if I do, I don't go to the higher dose. I don't know if you guys remember, but when the metformin first came out, it got a little, number one, it got a little bit of a bad rap because of the potential side effects. But number two, because it caused a lot of gastrointestinal effects, a lot of bloating, and it's really because of what it's doing to the gut microbiota, which turns out is actually a good thing, but it may be too quick. But then it came out as an anti-aging drug, right? Which low doses can actually help prevent cancer. So I have a lot of colleagues that are taking it at very low doses. My thing is, you still have some side effects. And there's so many other things you can do for longevity, right? You can do the fast mimicking diet. You can do intermittent fasting, right? There's just a lot of other things. I think it's what you choose to do. And as long as you're looking at the potential side effects and you're taking care of that, there's good studies on it.
Okay, back here.
Yeah, first I want to thank for your wonderful talk here. However, it was a little too much for me to really take home and act on it. Do you have any colleague in the Bay Area who is thinking along your same line, not necessarily the same, but in general, where I might be able to find some help?
Who is looking at insulin first, especially? Mm-hmm. Where in the Bay Area are you?
Here, Palo Alto.
I don't know someone specifically here. I know a person in San Francisco, Dan Dunphy, and I have a couple people from the fellowship. I just don't know them off the top of their head, but I know someone who's in Fremont, and I can get that for you.
Okay, appreciate that.
So maybe they can come up and ask you after. Okay.
Yeah. To dovetail on the question of insulin, what do you think of the digestive enzyme DAO as well as digestive enzyme broad-based plus a probiotic instead or in addition to metformin? I'm specifically asking about DAO and see if...
Well, I think it's really important to remember how with insulin resistance I said there's three things, and addressing the gut microbiota. Probiotics have been well studied in that, and there's four ones that have been well studied, even when you don't change the diet, that they can actually help reverse insulin resistance. I think with digestive enzymes, I think we need to look, and it's not that I'm against them, but I like getting to the root cause. So if someone is low, I want to know how low and why. Because, for example, you can measure pancreatic function, exocrine and endocrine, right? So you can look at pancreatic elastase, which is a marker of digestive enzymes. And if the pancreas isn't working optimally, you may need a lot higher doses than like with DAO, for example. So I think it's important that we also measure and we see exactly what you need. But if you're just using one across the board, in general, I think it's a good idea, but in many cases you need much higher amounts.
But are there any concerns with DAO at all?
I don't have a lot of experience with it because I'm more at let's look at what's the underlying root cause. So I haven't used it that much. I've read upon it, but I don't have the clinical experience with it.
What do you think about bioidentical hormonal replacement through the mucosa, like between upper cheek and the gum?
I don't like it. And I don't like it because we don't know how much is being swallowed. And there's a school of thought that if you're doing it by mouth, that you could be potentially using the bad and the ugly pathway. There's not a lot of literature on this. So I know there's some people that are using sublinguals, for example, or troches, where you can just park it sort of on the side of your mouth. The studies were done on skin, transdermal and transvaginal. So I only stick with those because I am afraid that they could still be swallowing. When it comes to estrogen, progesterone, or testosterone. When it's DHEA or pregnenolone, we do have studies on sublingual, and I will use it that way.
What is the test for insulin resistance in the brain? When
There really isn't. So what you do is you look for insulin resistance peripherally, right? I mean, the test for insulin resistance is the cognition studies, really, that you would address. But that's still being studied in terms of developing a marker. We don't have a really good marker yet, right? We're working on it. Dr. Bredesen is actually the one that's come up with the sort of the best studies on that. But you look for insulin resistance in the body in general, and not just looking at hemoglobin A1C, but look at fasting insulin as well as insulin after meals, especially if the fasting is normal. And normal is like between 5 and 7, not what the labs say, right? Because the labs can have reference ranges. They're not normal ranges, they're reference ranges. But you want to look within that and see what's optimal. And optimal is a fasting of no more than 5. Sometimes I'll tolerate 7 depending on the patient.
How do you look at lemons as a detoxifying agent and immune system booster?
You mean lemons in general or like lemon juice? Lemons, yeah, because there's the lemon rind, right? Yeah, the rind, and which has a lot of limonene, and then
the whole lemon, yeah.
No, I think, like, for example, for first thing in the morning, drinking a glass of water with a juice of a half a lemon, it's both alkalinizing, even though it's an acidic thing. Once it hits the stomach, it's actually alkalinizing. Plus, it's rich in antioxidants. Yeah.
And what about people that say when they eat lemon, they get an acid reflux action?
Well, they have reflux, period, and it's probably not just the lemon. We need to figure out where they have GERD, right, where they have gastroesophageal reflux disease.
I did. So I want to say in regard to the insulin resistance that a lot of time blood sugar will go up due to the fact that you have food sensitivity, gut bacteria, and especially if at that point of measurement, estrogen is circulated or recirculated and not secreted.
But in that case, you still need to address the insulin first, because a lot of times if you address the insulin, then you don't have the problems with estrogen.
Yeah, but I want to say it's not necessarily the food that you're eating that rise up the insulin.
No,
that can be measured.
But so changes in the gut microbiota, you're right, can also lead to insulin resistance, absolutely. Food sensitivities, which is actually part of why it was on my list.
Self-production of antibodies can do that.
Right, but then you're back to looking at why do they develop the antibodies. Yeah, exactly. But that's why food sensitivities are actually on my list of potential triggers, even though I didn't say that necessarily. Yeah, thank you.
If someone tests that, that they have the 216 pathway and they're taking bioidentical, some of the ones you talked about, what can they do with either their diet or lifestyle to shift that pathway if they've repeatedly tested the 216?
Good question. Actually, I don't like doing the 2 to 16. I think that Dr. Leonore Rogam is the one who's done the most work, and what she has shown is that you can look at the ratio between the 2-hydroxy, so the good, and the bad, that's 16. But there's not measuring the ugly. And what we've seen in clinical practice is that even when you change the 2 to 16 ratio, it hasn't translated into better outcomes. So in other words, we're not seeing less breast cancer risk or hormone-related cancers. And I think it's because we're not looking at the 4, number 1. Number 2, we're only looking at phase 1. 2 to 16 doesn't look at phase 2. And even 2 is not protected unless it's methylated. Right? And when you look at the 2 to 16, what did I say phase 1 does? It makes a fat-soluble toxin more water-soluble. So what do you create? You create a more toxic intermediate, thank you. And if you're creating a more toxic intermediate, you're actually increasing oxidative stress. So the problem with the 2 to 16 is that it doesn't look at phase 2, and it's phase 2 that's important. It's whether you're methylating, are you glucuronidating, are you conjugating it with glutathione. And so we need to be looking at the 2, the 4, and the 16, and the methylation. So the 4-methoxy and the 2-methoxy. That's extremely important. And I waited for those tests to come out. And they've been out since like 2005, 2006 in the US. They were before that in Europe. But it's still not being put into clinical practice in general, which is really sad.
Hi. Originally, I was told that it's very dangerous if you missed the window to start any kind of supplementation, years and years after menopause. But recently, a physician told me that there are studies showing that that's not true, and he was willing to work with me. So I'm curious what you think.
Well, the original study said that it was that window, right, that you needed to be started between 50 and 59, and that if you didn't, you could increase your risk. Right. But those studies were on, guess what? They want conjugated equine estrogens and progestin. So they want Provera and methoxyprogesterone acetate and your Premarin, your Primprose. When you look at the studies that were looking at the bioidenticals, you don't see that much risk. You don't see the increase in risk, but those are later studies, right? Those are like, well, either they're early studies or they're late studies. So one thing that always bothered me is when I was in medical school, and even early on in residency, I heard and learned and sort of forced to memory how good estrogen is for the heart, right? But those were early studies. What do you think they were done on? Synthetics or bioidenticals? Bioidenticals. No, not the early studies. The early studies were actually done on estradiol. Then we had this era of all we were told to use was synthetics, right? Conjugated equine estrogens. And then we had the study that was only on the conjugated equine estrogens, and we're sold, oh, you have to stop all hormones. No, you have to stop conjugated equine estrogen, and you have to stop doing orally. But how could you negate those years of studies from before where it showed positive effects? I think the problem is that instead of sort of looking at the literature and saying, well, how could we be wrong, right? Why is it that before we're saying it was good and now it's not? It's really a product of big pharma and advertising, right? Or even just compare it to the European studies. I mean, because the European studies, they were using predominantly the bioidenticals. You know, there's very few using Provera. There are some countries, and in some areas that still are. So the later studies now are showing that maybe that's not such an issue. It can be an issue in terms of we don't know how much neuronal damage you have or how much you can recover. But you know, I've had patients with pretty progressive Alzheimer's where the family told me, I don't care what the risk is, I just want my mother to recognize me. And I don't just start them on hormones, I do everything. I won't start them on hormones if I'm not going to do the hormonal symphony and I can't work on their diet and their lifestyle. But even with those, you can see drastic changes. So I think that our brains are plastic, right? There's neuroplasticity. So there's a lot of things that we can sort of regress. We just don't know how much until you take it to each person.
What type of tests do you recommend to test all the different estrogens and the pathways? And can you go into a little bit more detail of the ratios between the different
Sure.
estrogens that are needed for health?
So the 2:16 ratio can be done in urine or in serum. So it can be done in the blood or it can be done in urine. But that's not the best one because it doesn't give you the second step. The second step can only be done in urine. The Dutch doesn't look at the 4, so I don't do the Dutch.
So
because
which test do you do
the Dutch
then?
looks at the 2, and the owner thinks that because you're looking at the 2, that it's not as important to look at the 4. I disagree because there's many people that can have higher amounts of 2-methoxy and the 4 is not. There's something about the 4 that makes it really hard to methylate and to further conjugate. And I know this clinically, there's not a lot of studies on it. So I think you need to look at the 2-methoxy, the 4-methoxy, the 2-hydroxy, the 16-hydroxy, and the 4-hydroxy.
So is there a different test kit or something like that?
Yeah,
besides the Dutch test?
different companies have it. I use the one from Genova. It's called Complete Hormones. You can also do just estrogen metabolism, but for the same price. You can do Complete Hormones, which is even more extensive than the Dutch, but you're looking at all the metabolites and you're looking at the estrogens. I think ZRT is coming out with a similar test too, but that can only be done in the urine for now. But you can't do the 4 in blood. The 4-methoxy can only be done in urine. Yeah, 4-hydroxy and 4-methoxy, it's only in urine.
I wanted to know your opinion on estrogen in soy products. What do you think about them?
Well, the problem with soy is that most of our soy is GMO. You know, if you're in Japan where it's non-GMO, not such a problem. So, and the other problem too, besides it being a genetically modified crop with respect to soy, is that not everybody can digest soy. Now, if you're looking at the soy extracts, right, then like genistein, for example, we have some studies on those that you can use for like menopausal symptoms. But there's other things you can use. Let's say you don't want to do hormone replacement, right? But you want to try and maintain brain function. Well, there's a product. In Europe, it's called ERR731. It's a rhubarb, a root extract. In this country, I believe only Metagenics has it, and it's called Estrovera. It works on the estrogen beta receptor. So the beta is protective. This is why I want to use estriol and estradiol, because estradiol works on an alpha receptor, which can be more stimulating. The estriol works on a beta, which can actually inhibit. So let's say that you're putting someone on estradiol and you may be increasing their risk for a cancer cell that they have for it to grow. If you use the estriol with it, if you use something that binds the beta receptor, it cancels it out. It's protective. But you can do the same thing with a rhubarb extract because it works on the estrogen receptor beta. So in patients who want some of the cognitive effects and want the effects on bone but don't want to go on hormones, I use that.
Okay, we'll take one more question here, I think, and then, or maybe two. Okay, you got your hand up really fast. So 2 more questions, and then if you have any further questions, hopefully you'll take a few questions. You know, people, you can come up and talk with our speaker. So here we go.
Yeah, what's the best way to test if the person has Alzheimer's disease?
There's no really good test to do it. My best test is to see if they're insulin resistant, right? It's not just to, in other words, because if they're insulin resistant, you know they're more at risk. I mean, you can also do ApoE, right? ApoE4. You can look for the genetics, but that doesn't tell you if they're activated, right? It just tells you that if you have 2 copies, so if you got the ApoE from your mom and from your dad, you have a 50% higher chance of developing it. If you only have 1, you have a 30% higher chance, right? But aside from doing some, you can do tests, like you can do the PET scans or some of the cognitive tests. To me, if I could only do one thing, I would reverse insulin resistance, right? So pre-diabetes. So looking at insulin and really following the diet, doing all the things to get your insulin, you know, the levels optimized.
Okay, last question.
Okay, last question. I'll make it quick. Is there a step-by-step way that we Americans can fix our medical system?
And give it to me in 2 seconds, right?
In 5 minutes or less.
Oh, God, I wish there was. It's just like it's so broken, and I'm faced with that every single day. You know, I try as much as I can to get, if I'm prescribing something, I try to find out, you know, can I get it through insurance? Because, for example, we know nutraceuticals. You know, there's companies that, pharmaceutical companies that are now making nutraceuticals because it's money-making, right? And so anytime I try to do anything, I get called, no, that's not covered. Oh, no, you can't do it. And it's just so frustrating. I feel like we're going down a deeper and deeper rabbit hole. So I'd be happy to hear what you have to say.
On that really happy note.
I'm sorry?
Well, yes, we'll take, it's
Where?
time to take a break.
Capitola.
Capitola. All right, well, please thank Dr. Trindade one more time.
Thank you.
All right, great, thank you very much. Okay.